the Man in the Cage MMA and Combat Sports Podcast. Here's your host, Jeff Brantley.
Welcome in, everybody, to episode 84 of the Man in the Cage MMA and Combat Sports Podcast. As always, here your host, Jeff Brantley. Glad to be back with you today on a Friday edition of the show, a big Friday edition. We have a bunch of fights coming up later tonight and this weekend, of course. We have UFC 261 coming up Saturday. That'll be a big focus of today's show. I'll have some brief PFL stuff at the end here, but mostly going to go over UFC 261. And to also go over 261, having a little help there, I'm bringing my guy Luke Lampe from Sparring with Reality Betting on. So Luke will join me in one second. We'll go over this card top to bottom, look at some of the betting angles, also look at these fights in general as part of our UFC 261 preview. You can follow me on Twitter at Jeff_Brantley. Same thing on Instagram, guys, at Jeff_Brantley. Also check out the website, maninthecagemmma.show. You can get all the latest blog content up there, all the latest merchandise, as well as pledging to become a supporter of the show. As little as $1 a month, all the way up to $10 a month, whatever you can afford. Go to maninthecagemmma.show if you love the show. Pleasure to become a supporter of the show. I love all my supporters out there once again, so go check it out, maninthecagemmma.show. And then, of course, we're on YouTube now, as you can see. On the first video episode with Luke here as well coming up shortly, but go check out the Man in the Cage MMA and Combat Sports Podcast YouTube channel just by searching that Man in the Cage MMA and Combat Sports Podcast. It's also up on my Twitter, at Jeff_Brantley. Same thing on Instagram, at Jeff_Brantley. If you go to the link in my bio, there's a link tree, and there's a link to the YouTube channel there. Go ahead, go there. Hit the subscribe button, hit the follow button. Now you get the latest notifications whenever a new video drops. And then, again, if you're more old school, if you're driving around, that's more convenient for you, you still want to listen to the audio version, that'll still be available over on Anchor, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. All right, let's not waste any time. Let's get right into it today. A lot to talk about with UFC 261 coming up Saturday night. Again, there's some PFL tonight, the Professional Fighters League returning. I do think it's a big deal. Anthony Pettis fighting as well as Clay Collard. There's going to be some good matchups, so we're definitely going to talk about them on the show, but it just so happens to also be UFC 261, the next UFC pay-per-view weekend here. So we're going to start out with that, go through that mostly to start the show here, then get some PFL content at the end segment here. So without wasting any time again, pleased to welcome onto the show now via Skype, Luke Lampe from Sparring with Reality Betting. Luke, it's been way too long, man, since I've had you on. It's great to catch up with you again here. Talk some fights tonight as we edge closer to UFC 261 coming up on Saturday night in Florida. How's it going today, man? How you doing?
Pretty good. Yeah, I'm about all the way almost through next week's card already. But yeah, I jumped in on this one, got through it on Monday. So yeah, I've been trying to get to some PFL and ACA and LFA and stuff this week. But yeah, just grinding away as usual.
I hear you on that one. And I didn't even ask you this before I brought you on here about PFL or any of that stuff. Maybe we can get into that. I guess I'll just ask you now real quick, then I'll introduce you, and I promise we'll get to UFC 261. But do you go big on the PFL, or, is it similar to Bellator for you? How do you look at the PFL as far as betting goes?
Yeah, I started dabbling in it a little bit last year, but I guess in terms of like going big into it, I was a little bit more hesitant just with at least how the rules were last year, especially with like playoffs and stuff, with like the first 2 rounds, and then they score, like if it's a one guy wins one round, the other guy wins another one, they score it for like the first guy. So I was a little bit more careful with it, just with the rule set and potentially guys fighting multiple times in a night and that type of deal. But
yeah,
my reads in general last year on it were pretty good. I don't think I really tracked much with it, but just because I started dabbling with it. But yeah, it's honestly probably my favorite promotion outside of the UFC, which might be an unpopular opinion. I know everyone loves Bellator, but I've been watching the PFL ever since the first season back in, I think, 2018. I think it's a fun promotion.
Well, it should be an interesting year now, right? We have Anthony Pettis fighting in the PFL. Clay Collard, who's facing him in the first round, which is pretty cool. Others, of course, Fabricio Verdum. So PFL is going to be very interesting this year for sure. We'll maybe talk about more of that down the road, of course. We will talk mostly UFC 261 tonight as I bring Luke Lampe on the show with me. Of course, before we get to it, just have to plug everything for Luke, of course. He's partnered with Patreon. If you're looking for MMA betting advice, and I say this every time I bring him on, Luke is one of the best out there. Go sign up for Luke's bets. Go to his Twitter or Instagram Twitter handle, which is at SWR_betting. There in Luke's bio, you will find a link to Patreon to get Luke's bets for each card. There's 3 tiers to choose from: a $9.99 option, a $14.99 option, and a $19.99 option. And before he's also part of the Club and Sub podcast. I'll plug that real quick. Every Wednesday night, check those guys out. But real quick, Luke, before we move into that question, just explain to everybody what they get with the different tiers.
Yeah, essentially in the first tier, for $10, you just get my bets. Second tier, you get bets and pretty much all my content, full card breakdowns. I do them pretty in depth, usually anywhere between 10 to 15,000 words run through it. If I'm passing, I tell you why I'm passing. If I'm betting, tell you why I'm betting. Actually give you my cap in there where I actually line the fight, what my confidence level is, and also a little live betting spot in there. I also do a parlay content piece every week where I recommend at least, a couple fighters that are potentially parlayable to throw together. Didn't have one this week, ironically, because I think some of the favorites are a little too juiced. But usually every week I have a parlay article, and then I also do a prop article as well. So you get all that. In the second tier, the third tier, obviously everything in the first 2 tiers with bets and content, but I offer a monthly one-on-one coaching session as well that I do live on video. I think I've done about 3 or 4 of them now. It's a really fun time, a good way, to not only interact and meet my patrons, but kind of help them along the way, especially if you're a newer bettor. It's kind of the tier that I recommend. Ultimately, I did it to just help people not make the same mistakes I did when starting out, and we can bounce off how to cap fights, how much tape do you watch, any of that type of stuff. So yeah, it's been pretty fun. So I recommend that one for newer bettors. But yeah, 15, or I should say $10, $15, $20 a month. Pretty affordable, off to a killer start with 38.1 units of profit this year. Patrons on every tier, if you've been with me since January, you've already paid off a year's worth of subscription just in my bets alone content aside. So yeah, guys, check it out if you're looking for someone to tail, or even just another valid opinion out there.
Awesome. Yeah, go check it out at SWR_betting on Twitter and Instagram. That's where you can find Luke. And again, as I briefly mentioned there as well, you can also catch Luke as part of the Club and Sub podcast. He co-hosts on that show. You can catch that every Wednesday night. And again, I recommend go check those guys out. It's a very good podcast. So go check out Luke on the Club and Sub podcast. All right, Luke, UFC 261 going down Saturday night in Florida, in front of a full capacity crowd too, by the way, which will be a little bit different moving forward now, as it sounds like Dana White's just going to move, or not move, but put it in states where he can have full capacity crowds here again. So a full capacity crowd for Saturday night, UFC 261. We have 3 fantastic title fights on this card, along with some stellar fights to fill out the main card and the undercard prelims. We'll get to each of these fights as we go down the list here in a second. But of course, let's start out with that main event. We have Kamaru Usman defending his welterweight title against Jorge Masvidal. These two already, of course, have faced off once. Masvidal stepped up short notice last year for Gilbert Burns to face Usman. Obviously, Usman won that fight, was able to retain this title. Now, the second time around here, though, Luke, it could be a little bit more of a, it could be a little different of a story here, but it's still kind of interesting because on one hand, we have a blueprint sort of for this fight, how both fighters looked in the first one, but at the same time, again, and maybe some would, use it to say it's an excuse for Masvidal, but he did come in 6 days notice for that fight. He didn't have a full training camp. He's flying internationally around the world to get to this fight on Fight Island. So some different circumstances here. So maybe one of those fights where you can throw out a little bit of what we saw that first time around because of that 6 days notice for Masvidal. Either way, should be a good fight coming into this one. How do you see the fight playing out? Who's going to get the welterweight belt? Is it going to be and still or in new, in your opinion?
Yeah, honestly, even with the full camp, honestly, I really don't think it matters that much, to be completely honest. Like, obviously, you would have to assume that Masvidal is going to be more prepared here. I definitely don't disagree with that at all. But just from a general stylistic standpoint, this matchup aside, I mean, Usman's just proven to be a damn near impossible out. Extremely well-rounded, obviously very strong wrestler, extremely strong metrics, solid striking, solid pace, aggression, very strong, good cardio, good control time, good IQ, largely pretty defensively responsible. With all that being said, it makes him a pretty tough guy to beat. And, we can say, the first fight, Masvidal did come in on that short notice. But at the end of the day, it really still wasn't that long ago. So I do think, the performance is still relevant and representative. Usman got 5 takedowns, 16 plus minutes of controlled time. I think still outlanded him at distance when it was there, not significantly. I think only by 5 or 6 strikes, but still nonetheless outlanded Masvidal at distance, which I think is important to note. But yeah, I don't really see it going any different here outside of, Jorge, potentially finding lightning in a bottle
Yeah.
and catching him at space with something, because that's the one thing with Usman, though. Like, he's largely in the aggregate not a guy who's going to hang out at space for extended minutes. And even if he does, like I said, I mean, I think he's largely looked fine there. The really only time when guys have had success on him extensively at space was Covington in, the first couple rounds. But, Covington's also kind of a volume come forward machine, just bit down on the mouthpiece, hooks. Usman was kind of just, I think, playing almost a little bit of possum in that first round. And then we saw him really kind of take over the fight in the latter rounds too. So even first fight aside, I think an important stat to note is too that when two guys, at least in terms of a title fight, are getting a rematch and that fight's happened within a 12-month period and there hasn't been any other fights for either fighter in between, the guy who wins the first fight wins the second fight at a bare minimum 70% of the time. So I do think that's representative here. Obviously, Usman is, minus 400, 80%, but I think it's also justified given, the 50-45 result we just saw not that long ago, and given the stylistics of the matchup. So I just think it's going to be pretty much impossible for Masvidal to really win minutes here unless he catches him with something. And even first fight aside, I think it's important to note that, it's not, the first time that we've seen Masvidal struggle with a, strong wrestler or grappler. We saw what happened when he fought Damian Maia. Didn't get submitted, but got taken down, extensively controlled in that fight. Very similar story when he fought Benson Henderson back in the day. Pretty strong wrestler, decent jiu-jitsu player as well. So I don't know, man. I struggle to see Masvidal winning minutes unless he catches him with something. So I think we kind of see the same song and dance here.
I agree. And, that's why you kind of took the words out of my mouth there at the end, that to me, and again, Masvidal could land something big. I mean, he's very unorthodox as far as, coming from that street fighting background, that backing up or in combinations in the pocket, he can throw some, he'll throw boxing combinations from everywhere, right? So yeah, he could catch Usman, but this seems like the perfect fight for Kamaru Usman. It just seems like Jorge Masvidal is one of those guys who's built not to face elite wrestlers, right? The good wrestlers are going to give him a problem every single time, that they'll take him down, put him on his back. His jiu-jitsu is not great, right? I mean, it's all right, but it's not, he's not going to necessarily submit you off his back. So he's not Gilbert Burns even that way. So this does seem like a Kamaru Usman special here. And I agree with you. I think he's going to retain the title again. And then we can stop with the nonsense of 6 days and all that stuff. I mean, again, he's going to be a little more prepared, but I think we're going to see mostly the same things here for Kamaru Usman against Jorge Masvidal. And last one, before we move on to the co-main event here, just does it worry you at all, though? And I will throw this out there. I'm not necessarily worried right now, but I want to get your thoughts on this. Are you worried at all that Usman goes out with a different game plan this time around and tries to just box with Jorge Masvidal? Because some of the comments he's saying, and again, maybe, this is fight week speak, this is talk going up to the fight. He may go out there and just shoot takedowns the whole time, but he's talking about, I'm going to finish him, I'm going to hit him, and Masvidal's taunting him, saying he doesn't hit hard. So a little part of me, just a little bit worries, hey, Kamaru Usman goes out there and says, hey, look what I did to Colby Covington. Let me go try to just box the whole fight. Does that worry you at all? Or do you think because Kamaru Usman has great ring IQ, fight IQ, and he trains at a great with a great gym, team elevation. I mean, where's your thoughts on that? Do you think does that worry you at all that he would do that in this fight?
Honestly, not really. I kind of more chalk that up to just fight week speak. And I think, honestly, Usman knew what he was doing, even after the first result. That, the fact that it's being rebooked, I think it's kind of playing right into his favor, where I think he's kind of almost taking even some more the more pro wrestling type angle of, you don't want to necessarily bury the other guy you're wrestling because you want to build it up, build the fight up. So he's saying things to, build more intrigue. But if you really watch him historically, you touched on it, man. He's just got really great fight IQ. He's not a stupid fighter. He knows that his best path here is to wrestle. Once again, we just saw him get 16 plus minutes of control time in a 25-minute fight. So controlled Masvidal for over 60% of that fight just not that long ago. So he just doesn't strike me as the kind of guy that would do that. But like I even said in the first fight, in the times that we're at space, it's not like Masvidal was out there just lighting him up
Yeah.
at space either. That just wasn't the case. So hypothetically, even in the scenario that he quote unquote decides to stand and strike more than he probably should, I'm still not overtly worried.
Yeah.
I think that would definitely be maximizing the win condition of Masvidal, which once again I think would be pretty stupid.
Yeah.
From especially now that the guy's the champion, he's making the most amount of money he ever has. He just does. Guy's got a family, he's got a young daughter. He just doesn't strike me as the guy who's really gonna try to go put his ego out there. I think he's gonna go out there and try to win the fight, wrestle, and do what he usually does to wins. Because I just don't think there's a ton of evidence to sit there and say that, or as to why he would want to go do that. I mean, you talk about the Covington fight where he stood and struck more, but Covington's also is an elite level wrestler too. So
yeah.
that wasn't particularly shocking because it's not the first time we've seen two wrestlers go out there and stand and throw shots. But the dynamic of this fight is much different than that one. So long-winded way of saying I think it's all mostly nonsense, and he comes out here and wrestles.
I agree. We talk about guys pulling stunts sometimes. If Usman came out Saturday night and did not wrestle, that to me would be a big stunt. I think he has to. I think there's too much of a window there for him not to. So I agree with you on that one. All right, co-main event, we have Rose Namajunas taking on Zhang Weili for the women's strawweight title. Last time we saw Weili, she was going 5 rounds with Joanna. In my opinion, one of the greatest women's fights of all time. As for Rose, last time we saw her, she was getting some good revenge against Jessica Andrade, who's also on this card, fighting in a different weight division now, though. Who do you think is going to get their hand raised Saturday, Luke, in this strawweight division matchup?
Yeah, I like Weili. I actually wasn't, I've actually been a lot lower on Weili in the past than a lot of people have. I bet Joanna against her, I think at like plus 170. Obviously a very competitive fight, might be in the minority here, but I still think there's a solid argument that Joanna won that fight. If you take, the facial optics out of it, striking was very, very competitive. Also, if they were scoring leg kicks, I think that could have played a bigger factor in terms of how it was judged. But nonetheless, I was 100% fine with that decision. It was a great close fight. But I think it's going to be a little bit more difficult for Rose. And in saying that, I don't necessarily think Zhang just comes out and blows her out of the water early, because I do think Rose has a style to, make this fight, or at least some rounds, competitive. But the real comparison and why I like Weili in this spot is going back and actually watching Rose fight Andrade. Now, Rose won that fight 29-28, but Andrade busted her nose up in that third round and really took over. Obviously, a little too late in that spot. But what I will say, if that was a 5-round fight, I'm pretty confident that Jessica Andrade would have actually beat Rose there. And really the common theme, too, is when she started to get busted up, one of Rose's biggest core competencies is, her kickboxing, her outside lateral movement, her footwork. But when she started getting tagged, man, if you go back and watch that third round, that footwork really slows down. That output really slows down. And I really think that's a very disconcerting thing to have against a girl in Weili Zhang, who hits like an absolute truck, kicks very well rounded. Obviously, a very physically strong girl, very technical, even in doing so, has hooks from hell. So the big difference for me in the fight, I think, is just the physicality between the two, and obviously the power upside from Zhang. So I actually have a bet on Zhang here myself. Not a huge one, because like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if Rose made some of these rounds more competitive. But I think the line and everything is largely pretty justified here, because I just don't think Rose can handle the phicality of a girl like Zhang, especially over the course of 25 minutes.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why, again, and you said it, and I totally agree with you. That second Andrade fight, if that was a 5-rounder, I think it would have been way different. Andrade, she seemed like she was starting to smell the blood in the water a little bit there. And again, who knows? Maybe she doesn't finish her, whatever. But, that was one of those fights where you go back. Yeah, I mean, the 5 rounds is a big difference for Rose in these spots against, again, someone like Weili, who's very physically strong. And for Weili, I mean, the game plan has to be, you would think. Now, is everyone at as much of a tank as Andrade is, just walking you down, hurling big haymakers? No, but Weili can do her own walking her down with her pressure. I think that's probably what, if she's smart, that's what she goes with, is walking her down, keep that pressure on. And as you said, you see Rose as, as the fight went on, you saw the footwork break down. You started to see her be a little slower, not being able to circle out as much, getting stuck in corners, getting stuck up against the cage. And I think something similar will happen here. And the difference too, though, here for Rose, for Namajunas this time around, though, compared to Andrade, is Weili has the type of game to take a round two, right? So she's not, she could be, even on the scorecards or up going to those later rounds. I agree with you. I have Zhang Weili in this one. I think she gets the win over Rose Namajunas, and I even think it sets up to be a finish for her. It just seems like this could be a finish for her, and because I do think people were overlooking her power a little bit. Joanna, yeah, she was knocked out by Rose in that first fight, but you look at the weight cuts that Joanna was having. She would have terrible weight cuts. Her chin was very compromised in that fight against Rose. Rose doesn't have, the power for Rose. She has a little bit, don't get me wrong, but it's not as much as some people think it does. But Zhang Weili, even though she was putting it on Joanna in that fight, Joanna's got a pretty good chin now. She's always had a pretty decent chin. So I think this could be a stoppage win for Weili in this one against Rose Namajunas. All right, first title fight of the night, of course. We had 3 of them. We talked about 2 of them already. The one that'll start the night title fight-wise for us is Valentina Shevchenko taking on, as we just mentioned, Jessica Andrade. To me, this could be fight of the night depending on what Andrade does. And the only reason why I say that, and I guess it won't be just what Andrade's game plan is too. It'll depend on how Valentina Shevchenko looks, because last time we saw Shevchenko, now she was coming off some knee surgeries, right? She was coming off some surgeries. She hadn't been in there in a hot second. She was probably a little bit rusty, but Jennifer Maia made that a tougher fight than most people thought it was going to be. If Andrade could go out there and use her pressure, maybe use some wrestling and jiu-jitsu, maybe this could be a similar fight, even more so here, maybe more competitive than that Maia Shevchenko fight. So I think some factors line up here. It could be one of the better fights of the night. How do you see this one shaking out, Luke?
Yeah, I'm more so on the side that I think Shevchenko actually kicks her in the head and knocks her out. But honestly, I do think there is a very valid argument and case to be made for Andrade in this fight, at least from a value perspective of where the line currently sits. And I say that, and it's ironic because given how defensively flawed Andrade is and everything, like I said, I'm predicting her to get knocked out. But I've always said for the longest time that I don't think there's a girl out there who's going to go out there and, out technique a Valentina Shevchenko, who's going to win a pretty range striking type based fight with Valentina. Like I don't think there's a 125-pound girl in the world that can beat her at that game. She's 100% elite and the cream of the crop in that capacity. But that's pretty much the diametric opposite of what Andrade is, and that's why I think it does make the fight somewhat interesting because like I said, I don't think a girl can go out there and have that pretty fight with Shevchenko and win. But I think to beat a girl like Shevchenko is the archetype I would classify is a girl like Andrade who has to get in there, make it a dirty, ugly, greasy fight. Make it an unpretty fight, a gritty, tough fight. Like you said, maybe mix in some wrestling. She is a jiu-jitsu black belt. But even with that being said, I still think it's lower percentage. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised to see Andrade have some success early. Like you said, I mean, Jennifer Maia went out there, had a strong first round. We saw even Juliana Pena actually probably put on one of her best performances in the UFC, in my opinion, even in a loss. She had a lot of clinch success against Valentina early in that first round before getting submitted. So, yeah, I do think Andrade has some upside here, but just the defensive flaws for her are just so massive. And the fact that she's also pretty bad at cutting off the cage, she's pretty reliant on to just follow her opponents around. Yeah. So I think Shevchenko does have the ability to play that stick and move game and keep her at bay. The question just really becomes, can Andrade, play that bulldozer, get inside and have, consistent success? And this might be a bit of a hot take. Because if that is the case and Andrade is able to get inside on her, I think she's actually pretty live for a knockout, because I would say if she is able to get inside with that type of consistency to effectively win minutes over the course of a 25-minute fight and win a decision, I think that the knockout probably happens before then because that's going to be a lot of attritional work that she's going to be able to do. And Andrade hits very, very hard.
Yeah.
I almost think that might be the better way to play it and just buy your unit size down and take like a half unit. I think her KO is like plus 500, plus
Yeah.
600. I think that could be a nice little flyer. But with all that being said, I do think the line on Valentina is a little bit wide. It's not enough for me to bet on Andrade, just given the massive defensive holes, and I think Shevchenko can probably snipe her and put her out. But I think it's a very interesting dynamic of the fight, and probably the girl out there, if there is one, to beat Shevchenko. So if the upset was pulled, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, I wouldn't either, but like you, I'm on Shevchenko here. And if Andrade, you mentioned it there, she kind of follows her opponent on a straight line, right? She doesn't really, she doesn't really cut off the octagon, so she's just gonna follow Valentina straight. And if she were to use more head movement when she's doing this, I would like her a little bit more. But she tends to keep her head right there for you, right? And it's just kind of a dare, I dare you, just tag me. I don't really care, hit me, and I'm just gonna try to walk you down, land bombs, get you in the clinch. Now, again, she could have some success doing that. And I think that's probably what she's going to try to do is obviously do that. But not only do that, but try to get her up against the cage, try to use some wrestling, especially as we saw Valentina have some issues off her back against Jennifer Maia. Now, Maia's got some pretty good jiu-jitsu, but so does Andrade. She's a black belt, right? So it could be an interesting fight, but it can also be one, as you said there, that could be a quick night for Andrade. If she eats a nasty combo walking in or a kick up the middle or a knee or anything, could be a short night for Andrade, or it could be a very entertaining fight. We'll see. But I'm on Valentina with you there too, as well. As I just think there's too much in her game to be able to deal with Jessica Andrade there, but should be a fun one. All right, the rest of the main card here. Kicking off the main card, we have a middleweight and a light heavyweight clash. We'll go to the matchup in the middleweight division first, Luke. UFC veteran Uriah Hall, he's taking on fellow UFC veteran Chris Weidman. Weidman coming out the other day saying, he has like he has like a game plan of 4 fights that he wants to climb the ladder, then win the title and retire. So Weidman clearly trying to make that next title run. Uriah Hall obviously wants to do that too. He's coming off a win after I won't say he retired Anderson Silva, but he kind of did a little bit. Coming off that win, what's your prediction in this one, Luke?
Yeah, it's definitely a very volatile matchup, I would call it. But one, I actually do like Weidman here, just largely because I think he is a good archetype to beat a guy in Uriah Hall. Uriah Hall consistently has just, I shouldn't even say consistent. In my opinion, I don't think Uriah Hall has ever had a complete 15-minute performance in all of his UFC fights, and he's been in the UFC for quite a few years now. He's lower output. He doesn't deal well with pressure. He's a guy who's been on record saying that he struggles with the mental part of the game. He's one of those guys you just don't really ever know which Uriah Hall is going to show up. We've seen him be, more aggressive in some spots, but largely he's kind of willing to play the outside, play the counter game. With all that being said, he's very fast, very explosive, very powerful, diversity attacks, those nasty spinning wheel kicks, throws rockets down the pipe when he decides to let it go. But the problem is, he often just doesn't let it go, and he's, losing fights until he's winning. I mean,
Yeah.
If you even just run back through some of his recent ones, the Anderson Silva fight, despite winning that in the 4th round, he was having competitive minutes with the 45-year-old Anderson Silva,
Yeah.
which probably really shouldn't have been the case. Antonio Carlos Jr., close fight that he pretty much won just based off of damage and optics, but Carlos Jr. did take him down, have a lot of back control time, backpacked him, was defensively responsible and Hall did not get submitted, but squeaked a split there. Bevon Lewis knocks Bevon Lewis out in the 3rd round, but also dropped the first 2 rounds to Bevon Lewis. Paulo Costa ran through him. Christoph Jocko knocked Jocko out in the 2nd round, but Jocko had a strong 1st round. Musasi pretty much had a strong 1st round in the 2nd fight. Brunson nuked him early, so that's just running through his last 7. We could go down the list and talk about Whitaker and all the other fights, but my point is that I think he's largely pretty reliant on a knockout here, and given that I think, despite some of the good guys that Hall's fought, I think Chris Weidman is the best pure wrestler that he's ever fought. His takedown metrics are outstanding. He's a black belt in jiu-jitsu, very strong on top, good ground and pound, good submission game when he decides to go to it. So despite Hall repping a solid takedown defense, it's not like he's invincible on the ground. It's not like he can't be taken down, and it's not like he can't be controlled or give his back, because there's multiple fights that suggest that's the case. So I do think that Weidman's going to be able to realize some takedown success here and essentially win a grinding wrestling based decision. But the common, talking point with Chris Weidman has been knocked out in his last 5 losses. His durability is questionable. I get it, but I think you also have to look at who he's been being knocked out by. A lot of solid guys, top 5 guys, even the most recent one, Reyes, that was up at 205 pounds. And given the game plan that I think he takes here, that's also going to limit that window for Hall to find the KO. So, yeah, I really like Weidman's spot. Like I said, it's volatile. Not a big play or anything for me, but just out of principle and minute winning ability. And I also think that Chris Weidman's a pretty underrated boxer in general. People just tend to look at, him getting iced, but in general, his hands actually really aren't bad at all. And I'd say actually are pretty good and underrated. So I think he actually can win minute standing. It's just, dicey game to play there. But
Yeah.
in general, around pick'em against a guy or on a guy who can win minutes exponentially better proven, more battle tested. I like Weidman to get it done.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Uriah Hall, as you said there, he's one of those guys that he'll be losing going into the 3rd round and in some of his fights, and then all of a sudden pull something out, right? Land something big, win the fight, and all of a sudden, the old baseball term, looks the same in the box score in the morning. For Uriah Hall, that's a little bit of what happens, that he is losing some of these fights, but then he just pulls something out, or he does enough later on in the fight, power punching wise, any of his strikes wise, where he starts to get the judges won over a little bit, or again, he finishes the fight. So, I mean, Weidman could always eat that big shot in this one, but just volume, wrestling, pure all-around game, it seems like Chris Weidman would have a little bit of an advantage going into this one on UFC 261. All right, the fight that's going to open up UFC 261, Luke, and I'm a little biased on this one. I'm a big Jim Crute guy. I'm a big Jimmy Crute guy. So maybe more excited about this fight than the rest of them, just because, again, I'm biased for Crute. I love his game, but he's back in the octagon taking on former title challenger Anthony Smith. Will Smith get closer to another title shot, Luke, as last time out, Anthony Smith did have a little bit of a renaissance in his game, or is it Crute's world here? Are we living in it? Is he going to take that next step towards becoming more of a viable contender down the road?
Yeah, it's a very interesting fight. I think it's the very first dynamic, I think, that makes the fight interesting. Anthony Smith is historically a pretty slow starter. I know he came out, took down Devin Clark, subbed him in the first round in his last outing. But if you really look at Smith over the long term, that was a very anomalous approach and outcome from Anthony Smith. I think he only lands like 0.49 takedowns per 15 minutes over a pretty large sample size. So, one, he's not wrestling very often. 2, he's not wrestling often and even early. Usually the submissions are coming, from his back and stuff like that, and triangles later on. So kind of a weird outcome from Smith, but that's also why Smith has just kind of been an anomaly and a very difficult guy to predict his fights. Because he is tough. He is a tough guy, and he can come on late in fights. But Crute's also a very strong starter, obviously a solid jiu-jitsu player. I think his hands are still a little bit green from a technical perspective, but he does have power. We've seen that. I'm not saying his hands are bad by any means. I still think there's some stuff he just needs to tighten up. But yeah, so that's kind of what I see. At least Jimmy, really pouring it on early. Smith can be wrestled as well. So yeah, I largely actually see a Jimmy Crute grinding based decision, but the big question I also have with Crute is what's his gas tank really look like in an extended fight? Because he's largely been an early finisher. I mean, you kind of got to go back to his Contender Series fight as well, which was a second ago, but that fight was more extended, and he was sucking a lot of wind. And Anthony Smith is not exactly the guy you want to be slowing down against. So that's kind of my concern, and why I guess I have some hesitation with Crute here against Smith. But I do think he actually is the better minute winner, optics winner, has finishing upside in the fight. But conversely, I think Smith does have finishing upside too, because Crute is pretty defensively flawed at space. But I guess my stinky angle is I actually don't think Crute finishes him, and Crute wins a decision, which is like plus 400 right now.
That's interesting. Yeah, because I'm on Crute. I think he does find the finish, but I can see what you're making a great point there for the decision. And, I do think Crute's going to get the W. I think this seems like a good spot that the UFC essentially, and again, Anthony Smith's a veteran. He has some, weapons in his arsenal. So this isn't a gimme for Jimmy Crute, but this just seems to me like the UFC putting a former title challenger, a somewhat big name in there with Jimmy Crute on a pay-per-view to give Jimmy Crute that more, give him that hype, to try to keep pushing him in that light heavyweight division. That's, kind of interesting right now as John Jones, what's the future for him? So I do think this sets up well for Jimmy Crute. I think he gets the win either way. Again, I think he does find the finish just because the power that he does possess. And Anthony Smith, I've kind of dubbed it the Gracie striking defense. He kind of doesn't move his head off the line. He doesn't keep a guard up. He kind of just backs up against the cage and hopes that you stop punching. I don't really know how else to explain it, really, that Anthony Smith's striking defense just has never improved over time. And we saw that in the Glover Teixeira fight, where early on he's putting it on Glover, but then all of a sudden, he starts to tire out. He's a little slow, and then he's getting tagged and backing up. I could see something similar happen there. But, again, on the flip side, as you mentioned, Jimmy Crute does some of that part of his game that he does need to improve is his striking defense, too. He does eat a lot of shots on his chin. Now, he's shown a pretty good chin so far, but you never know. Anthony Smith is a powerful guy, but I do have Jimmy Crute there as well in that one. All right, let's run through the rest of the card here, go to the prelims a little bit quicker than those, and I do have some other questions on the way out for you. But we'll start out with a feature prelim. We have Alex Oliveira taking on Randy Brown, and then I'll throw one more at you, and I'll let you talk about both these. Dwight Grant also taking on Stefan Sukulic in the welterweight division. Who do you see walking out of both those matchups with their hand raised?
Yeah, Brown Oliveira, that's probably one of the more volatile fights on this card for me, and I think it's a great fight to pass on from a betting perspective. I think both guys have been very, very up and down and very inconsistent in their runs. But conversely, I've always thought Randy Brown has been a guy who, has a decent ceiling and decent potential. I think he does have the ability and the tools to win this fight. I'm predicting to win this fight, I think he does just a little bit more, but we also have seen Randy Brown stuck on bottom. We have seen Oliveira go to the wrestling before, so I wouldn't be surprised there, but Brown does have some pretty long legs. I think he's a purple belt or brown belt in jiu-jitsu, has locked up some triangles and stuff from his back before. We've seen Oliveira slow down, gas. We also saw Oliveira most recently stick his head right into a guillotine against Rakhmonov. That was pretty frustrating, to be honest. As soon as he shot that takedown, I was like, Rakhmonov's going to jump the guillotine. He jumps the guillotine and then he submits him. It was just like very, very clear how that whole thing played out. So it was just a weird scenario. At the end of the day, I think both guys are just pretty hard to trust or put a decent degree of confidence in. But I think Brown squeaks a 29-28 decision.
Yeah, it seems like a Randy Brown spot there. And Oliveira, he could pull his own stunts. So can Randy Brown, though. So that could be a greasy fight right there. How about Dwight Grant and Stefan Sukulic?
Yeah, this is another really interesting one. I'm picking Grant, but he is not really a guy I ever really want to back with a minus next to his name. Even a plus, I wouldn't feel great about backing him just because he doesn't really do a whole lot. He's the guy who will, stand behind the black line, look to play the counter game, doesn't really wrestle a whole lot. He's kind of just content to do what he does. If he finds the kill shot, he finds the kill shot. If he doesn't, he's found himself in some pretty close fights, most notably against Joban and Otto. He's just another guy I think that's pretty hard to trust. And, we did see, him put it on Daniel Rodriguez early, and there's definite argument that fight should have been stopped, but it wasn't. And then, he turned around gassed after he flurried on him, and then he got finished himself. So in regards to Sekulic, I mean, he's a guy who will come forward. He will wrestle. He will throw strikes, but I'm honestly not really convinced he's UFC caliber. I think he's like I'd say a serviceable, well-rounded regional scene fighter. It's important to note he's also coming off a 2.5-year layoff and a USADA suspension, so he is no longer on the juice. It's always pretty difficult to have any sort of confidence backing guys coming off of steroid suspensions, especially if they got suspended very early on in their UFC run, because they've probably been taking it throughout their whole career. So how are they going to look off steroids? So it's another very volatile fight. I think Grant finds a knockout, but if he doesn't, would I be surprised if Sekulic squeaks something on the cards? Absolutely not.
Yeah, that minus 220 on some sports books right now. That's a little heavy for Dwight Grant, for sure. The rest of the prelims there, we have Carl Roberson taking on Brendan Allen. Should be a fun one there. I mean, both guys consider prospects in the middleweight division. Obviously, even if you don't consider them prospects anymore, at one point they were. So it should be a pretty good fight. How do you see that one playing out?
Yeah, I think it's largely pretty binary, not 100%. I think obviously Brendan Allen needs takedowns here. Um, Roberson's the much better striker, comes from kickboxing background, very fast, southpaw, powerful. He doesn't have a lot of knockouts, but the guy does hit pretty hard. So that's kind of ironic, but the guy does have hands. We've seen Brendan Allen be a pretty big liability at space. And I think it is somewhat disconcerting for Allen, too, in his last outing when he went and fought Sean Strickland, a boxing based guy. He didn't attempt any takedowns, proceeded to get, outstruck at distance 90 to 50 and gets knocked out in the second round. So big fight IQ questions there from Brendan Allen. Who knows if he shot takedowns, how much success he would have, but still, he's a grappler by nature. The fact that he wasn't shooting takedowns and decided to box with a boxer and a better boxer, that's a little disconcerting. Roberson, been submitted 3 times, but against, solid guys, Teixeira, Vittori, and I'm blanking on the other one, but he's gotten subbed by solid black belts. The problem with Roberson is that he still makes a lot of very small positional mistakes on the ground. He gives his back quite a bit. He fought Turman, who is a black belt as well, won a split decision there, was able to reverse position and actually win in the grappling, which is an interesting consideration for the fight because Brendan Allen is a guy who is very submission over position. He will constantly lose position to attack things. So could that potentially happen here, even if Brendan Allen is shooting takedowns and Roberson's just able to, get top time and be defensively responsible and not get submitted? I wouldn't be shocked, but largely, I more so think Brendan Allen shoots takedowns, gets takedowns, and I just haven't seen any evolution in the grappling defense from Carl Roberson. So I think that's what happens. But at space, man, I think Roberson lights him up pretty bad. So it's another fight that I don't really want to be invested in. I know Allen's gotten a decent amount of steam, but I think you got to know what you're getting into with Brendan Allen. You better have a pretty good degree of confidence, or have been in his DMs, that he's going to come out here and shoot takedowns after the last fight at least.
Well, I mean, if I'm him, obviously I am running out. We don't want to catch a knee, but I am sprinting out of my corner when the fight starts, and I'm shooting a takedown because that Strickland fight. Yeesh. I mean, that was, you're watching the first round, and sometimes you do this, but usually, a lot of knockouts will just come out of nowhere. But you kind of felt it was going to come at some point just because he was getting lit up so bad in that first round. You just knew that either his chin's going to go on him or the damage is just going to accumulate and he's going to get finished. So, yeah, I mean, he better go out there and try to shoot a takedown right away on Carl Roberson. The fight that'll open up the prelims before the early prelims, or after the early prelims, I should say, Patrick Sabatini taking on Tristan Connolly. We'll talk about this one, Luke, real quick, and then we'll move to if you have any other spots that you're looking at on the early prelims. But what's your thoughts on Sabatini versus Connolly?
Yeah, it's a little difficult just from a general capping perspective because there isn't a ton of footage out there on Connolly. I know he took some L's, more earlier on in his career. He's been on a nice little run in the latter half. I think he's 35 now. I think he's coming off of a couple neck surgeries, I believe, as well in this spot. BJJ black belt, obviously, scored that big upset over Michel Pereira. But what I will say is that Pereira gassed in that fight 2 minutes in. So people look at, the massive size discrepancy between the two. I listen, I can't take anything away from Connolly. The guy went in there, scored a massive upset and that did what he needed to do to win the fight. But at the end of the day, he was essentially fighting a tackling dummy, after 2 minutes. So kind of take that for what you will. I think it's also important to note despite having a ton of top time in that fight, he didn't actually land a takedown. All the times he got on top of Pereira was like Pereira tripping from kicks or falling or going to his back. And then, Connolly got on top of him. So that's important to note. But I'm actually a really big Pat Sabatini fan. Daniel Gracie black belt, decent wrestler. Not the greatest hands in the world, but neither really is Connolly. I don't think either guy's striking is great, but I do think the levels in the grappling between the two are there. And I think there's a bit more grind in Sabatini than there is in Connolly, coupled with more finishing upside in this spot as well. So I do think the line's justified, but I wouldn't feel good about laying over minus 200 on it, just given the limited footage on Connolly. But they opened this at Pick'em. I have a decent amount of shares on an early opening line, like untipped and tracked. But yeah, I have like some Sabatini at minus 115. I thought that was ridiculous, but yeah, I think Sabatini either subs him late or wins a grinding based decision.
I agree with you, and it should be a good fight to open up those prelims after the early prelims. And, there's so many fights to talk about, and I want to get to a few questions before I let you go. So we're just going to go kind of general blanket talking about the early prelims real quick. Is there any fights that you're looking at? Was there any fights that you taped that you really got a good read off of?
Yeah, so I didn't tape the Molina Aori fight. There just wasn't enough recent tape on Aori. I didn't tape Carnelossi or Lang either. There wasn't enough recent tape on them. If it's two fighters that are making their debuts that I know absolutely nothing about in general,
Yeah.
and then there's limited footage or not recent footage on them, I think it's just a difficult proposition to try to bet their fights because you find yourself making a lot of assumptions, especially if they're younger too, and the tape isn't recent. Big strides can be made within even 6 months, a year's time, and so if you're going back and watching something from when they're 19 and they're 21 now, that might not be really representative of where they're truly at. So I didn't look at those. Wrong. Vargas. I think Vargas potentially actually could be a live dog if he just goes to the wrestling consistently and makes it like a greasy, grindy fight. But I also don't think he's a UFC caliber fighter. This Wrong guy seems to be okay, but his strength of competition's been very poor. High volume striker, but guys have been able to get in on his hips with consistency. He's been stuck on his back, stuck on the cage. Looks like his get up game has improved a little bit, but I do think Vargas has a path to victory here. Conversely, I think Wrong probably lights him up at space. So pretty volatile there, but I think the value is 100% on Vargas as the dog. I think Batcarel absolutely smokes Natividad. It's probably my most confident take on the card. I think the levels in the striking between the two are pretty evident between hand speed, diversity of attack, athleticism, footwork, aggression. It all goes to Batcarel, also a pretty tough guy. Has some defensive problems, but has shown to be durable. We just saw Natividad, get knocked out in his last fight. Not saying he's chinny, hasn't been knocked out before. I get it, but he was still getting hit pretty clean at space from Milos Johns, who's a wrestling-based fighter, which is somewhat concerning. Where Natividad's just kind of going to walk forward, sit down on shots, doesn't check kicks, doesn't really move his head. I think Batcarel is very live for a knockout.
Absolutely. He is Luke Lampe. You can follow him on Twitter and on Instagram at SWR_betting. All right, Luke, just a few more for you before I get you out of here. And that was the UFC 261. Again, the card there. We went over most of those top to bottom. But I wanted to ask you, I'll start out here. I wanted to ask you this too, because as I mentioned at the beginning, we're getting back to crowds again. We're going to get back to where the UFC, especially, I don't know about some of these other shows they're going to put on, some of the fight nights, but pay-per-views, it seems we're going to get crowds back. We get UFC 261 in Florida, 262 in Houston. The crowd factor, it's a real thing for, I think, for fighters, number one, some fighters will feed off that energy, maybe get into brawls when they shouldn't, or vice versa. And also judging. Sometimes judges can be swayed a little bit more by the crowd. Now that we're getting crowds back here for the first time in about over a year here, are we factoring the crowd into any of our bets at all? Are you doing that? Are you looking at it and saying, hey, you know what, this guy, let's say it was a Cody Garbrandt, hey, maybe we should, maybe this will be a little different for a guy like Garbrandt now who likes to hear that crowd and start throwing and being reckless. Are you looking at the crowd factor, moving forward here a little bit more?
I think it's something important to consider, but it's another one of those like intangible type things that I think it's really hard to, put an official stamp on a fight. You say if this guy's fueled by the crowd or whatever, he's going to do this. I just think it's hard. And then especially when it comes to, the judging factor, when there's no crowd, there's a big crowd, they're in this state with this commissioner, this state, and it's always just like up in the air. You tape the fight, you research the fight, you think you have an edge here, you kind of play your chips where you will, and hope you have a competent group of people looking at the fight. But even last week we saw some pretty questionable decisions as well, and pretty much every week I think there's at least one fight where everybody's like, yeah, what the hell? So
yeah,
so it's kind of hard for me to like overtly consider it, because I just think it's one more, I guess, thing to put in the bag, but it's hard to do you add 2% or 5% onto your edge base?
Yeah.
I think it's just hard. I think you're making some assumptions in doing it, but I think it's something interesting to consider. It's just tough.
Yeah, I mean, I think unless you have a guy like a brawler, a fighter that's more of a brawler who can kind of feed off the energy, good and bad, maybe then you can look at it a little bit. Otherwise, obviously we don't know, we can't predict the future going into fight night, which fight. I mean, there could be a surprise fight of the night on this card where the crowd is going crazy and sways a judge one way or the other. We can't predict that, obviously. So I agree with you. I think it's hard to determine that factor a little bit, but maybe some cases you can a little bit. Not one more for you. I have a few more for you here. Live betting spots. Now, I want to remind everybody, go check Luke out on Patreon. His 3-tier options. I don't want to give anything away from your service. And that's why we've talked about the fights, but normally in the past I had you on, we'll throw all of your bets out there, right? We'll go through more specifically. So try to be a little careful for you there. But live betting, without giving too much away, is there any spots that you would be eyeing on this card?
Honestly, I would say Vargas potentially, because like I said, I think he could be getting beat up at space. But if I would look to monitor, is he aggressively wrestling? Is he getting in on his hips?
Yeah.
Does he have the potential to make it a grinding fight, or is he just standing there and getting lit up for 5 minutes? In that case, I'd say no. But if he's having some wrestling success, I think that could be an interesting live angle. Sekulic over Grant, we kind of touched on it, that Grant doesn't really let his hands go, isn't a volume machine, isn't a great minute winner. So assuming Sekulic doesn't get put out early, obviously make your reads how you will and how that first round is playing out. But I mean, if it's aggressive and he's not, if he's aggressive, he's not getting hit, overtly clean, making it dirty, I don't think that's a terrible spot. Even maybe Randy Brown over Oliveira. We've seen Oliveira slow down. That's kind of like the live angles I usually play, if looking at either if guys slow down or conversely if they just have the guy has a strong later round. So I think Brown could be an interesting target. Smith I think would be a pretty big flyer, but if this fight gets out of the first, I think that might be actually just one of the better blind live betting throws of the card. Hall. Obviously, kind of the comeback king, especially if you have money on Weidman pre-fight or money line, anything like that. I wouldn't hate throwing something on Hall after one, despite him clearly losing. You might get like a crazy plus number on it. It might be a good way for you to just kind of hedge out on anything Weidman, or even if you don't have anything on Weidman. I think Hall is always an interesting live target because we've seen him be getting absolutely worked in multiple fights and just kill somebody. It's happened on more than one occasion. So once again, it's a big flyer, but I think it's something that's in play that you might be able to get a decent price on. So those are, I guess, would kind of be my big spots.
Absolutely. And just to throw it out there to everybody, patreon.com, then go check you out, at SWR_betting on Twitter and on Instagram. How many bets do you have up there right now for everybody? They sign up for your service?
Yep. I currently have 4 up for UFC 261 on Saturday. Mm-hmm. I have 1 up for PFL tomorrow night. And I actually moved in on a pretty big play, a 3.5 unit play for the Reyes and Blachowicz card. Just yesterday. So yeah, I have six bets up currently, and I'm going to be diving even more deep into the Reyes Prochaska card too. So I'm assuming I'm probably going to end up pulling the trigger on a couple of those here before Saturday. So yep, 6 bets up right now. Money to be made.
There is some money to be made on this card. And last one, and this wasn't on the questions I sent you earlier, but just real quick here. Are you surprised at all? I'm a little less surprised that Valentina Shevchenko is around a minus 450 favorite over Andrade. Are you surprised at all that Usman's a minus 450 favorite over Masvidal? Does that surprise you at all? I mean, I'm not saying, again, we just talked about it. I think Usman's going to win. I think he has a clear advantage, but that's getting a little steep though, isn't it? I mean, Masvidal is a guy who, again, he could pull something out. Is that getting a little too steep for you there?
Honestly, I really don't think it is. I personally capped Usman, minus 400, 80%. So yeah, I get based on my cap minus 450. It's getting a little steep, but
Yeah.
Once again, to me, it just comes down to establishing what percentage you pretty much assign to a Masvidal KO, because yeah, I don't see any scenario where he's winning minutes on Usman over the course of a 25-minute fight. So with that being said, if you were to bet Masvidal, I would by no way means in any way, shape, or form recommend you lay the Masvidal money line. Don't do that. Play the KO prop. That's where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. I don't know where that currently sits, but that's how I would play it. But to answer your question, I do think it's more or so justified, just because I think that win condition of Masvidal is so small.
I agree there. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be knockout or bust for him coming up Saturday night. He is Luke Lampe. You can check him out Wednesday nights on the Club and Sub podcast. Also, again, we just talked about it a few times. Go check him out over on Patreon. 3 different tier options: a $9.99 option, a $10 option, a $15 option, and a $20 option. Go check it out. Go check him out on Twitter and on Instagram at SWR_betting. Luke, it's been a ton of fun, man, and I can't wait to have you on again soon. It's been too long, as I said. I'm gonna start bringing you on more and more, especially for a lot of these pay-per-views. It was great catching up, man, and have a good rest of your night.
Yep. Thanks for having me back on, Jeff. Yeah. Any pay-per-view. Yeah. We need to get back into the pay-per-view groove again.
We do.
Yeah. I always like talking to you and bouncing opinions off, because I get to talk to my Club and Sub boys every week.
Yeah.
We're often on a lot of the same spots, but we do take some digs here and there at each other. But I love talking to different people and getting different opinions. So it's always fun.
Yeah, it's always awesome, man. And again, we're on video now, so I guess me and you, we can't chug 40s on, or I guess we could probably if we wanted to. We could chug some 40s on our late night sessions here, at least tonight, our late night session. But it's been fun, like I said, Luke, and I'll talk to you later for sure, man.
Yep. Thanks, Jeff. Have a good one.
There you go, Luke Lampe. Once again, thank you for joining me from Sparring with Reality Betting. Go check out Luke one more time on Twitter and on Instagram at SWR_betting. All right, that's the full UFC 261 preview. I'll tweet out my picks as well coming up Saturday night. Should be a great card. I think there's going to be some fun fights on this one. And let's see who can spoil an upset, if any, right? We got 3 title fights. I honestly think we have 3 favorites who probably should be decent favorites. So if anyone's going to do it, again, it's going to be somewhat of an upset. But I think there are some capable fighters certainly in these fights. But as far as I'm concerned, I have the favorites in that. I think this is a good favorites card, if that makes sense. Not to say some dogs won't cash. Not to say, again, the 3 title fights, Masvidal doesn't land a clean shot. A Rose Namajunas does something, or, a Jessica Andrade walks Valentina Shevchenko down, lands some bombs, or uses her wrestling to get a decision. Not to say it doesn't happen, but the way I see it, I think these favorites are rightfully so favorites, and I think they're going to get the win coming up on Saturday night. All right, real quick, before I get out of here, do want to talk quickly about the PFL. It's returning tonight on ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN, something like that, ESPN Plus, all those. Very excited for this. I think the PFL has a golden opportunity this year, and I've talked about it on this show many times. Last year, whether it was having Jason Hagholm on or anybody else, or just giving my own opinion on it, the PFL had one of the worst years in combat sports. No doubt about it, right? They did not have any fights, right? They did not have any cards. Understandable. I mean, we had the COVID world. They couldn't afford it, testing, all that stuff later in the year came back. They couldn't put their whole season in. I get why they couldn't, but still, they weren't able to have any fights last year. They weren't able to put the season-long fighting schedule that they put on last year. So they missed out on that. Plus, you had last year a bunch of fighters looking to go fight, right? And again, fighters, a lot of them, they need to go out there. They need to be able to fight to keep getting paychecks. Well, the PFL was somewhat standoffish about letting some of these fighters go, especially if it's a UFC, especially if it's some of these other big promotions. They were a little hesitant on it. Now they did end up allowing Kayla Harrison to go have a couple fights outside of the promotion. That was pretty cool, but still, it was not a good PR year for the PFL. They can change that now, because you've got your big promotions, right? You're going to have the UFC, you have Bellator, you got one championship who's making their own push, especially on TNT now. You've got some of these other promotions, go even more minor leagues, LFA, Cage Warriors, so on and so forth. But the PFL can really make a big impact this year. I've always liked the PFL. I know some of you do out there as well, but I feel like this is the time when they can really grab people, really grab them coming out of this pandemic. That they signed guys like Anthony Pettis, who's fighting tonight against Clay Collard, which that is a fantastic fight. Clay Collard last year, when he went to boxing, why the PFL was off and why MMA, a lot of MMA was on pause unless you're in the UFC. Clay Collard was able to have a very successful run in boxing, more than a very good successful one. In fact, you might want to argue that maybe he should have just stayed in boxing. Not that he can't go back, but that type of fight tonight between Anthony Pettis and Clay Collard, that is a great fight. And that is a name in Anthony Pettis that fans will know, right? So you've got those names. And then you've got Kayla Harrison, as I just mentioned, who is going to be a big-time free agent at some point. You've got Fabricio Verdum. You've got Rory McDonald, who came up from Bellator. There's some names here in the PFL that they can make a splash if some of these fights, if these tournaments really catch on, really grab people, and I think they will. And it'll be interesting to see what Clarissa Shields does. Again, the I won't say former boxer, she's still boxing, but the world-class champion boxer, Clarissa Shields, she's going to get her feet wet in MMA on the PFL, as part of the PFL, which is awesome. I think that's a perfect spot for her. She gets to come into a semi-big spotlight now, test her skills out, maybe start getting some momentum, and then maybe an Amanda Nunes super fight at some point if Dana White's impressed, if the UFC wants to make that. So I think the PFL's got a golden opportunity. I'm not going to go, we've already spent so much time on UFC 261, and I'm not going to go down specifically. Maybe in the future here again, maybe some of these other cards, I'll go down a little bit more. When I don't have a guest on, when we don't have a pay-per-view, I'll go down the PFL card more, give more, more lengthy predictions. But just going to say that tonight, that's my prediction. I think the PFL's got a big year in store. I think this could be a golden opportunity for him. And Anthony Pettis, Clay Collard, whoever wins that fight very well could win the belt. They could win that side of the bracket. I think that's that good of a fight. That's why they matched him. They didn't want Collard. They didn't want Pettis. They didn't want something like that happening. This is a good attention-grabbing main event on PFL episode 1 season of the season here coming up tonight. So it should be very good. And again, you can follow me on Twitter at Jeff_Brantley. Same thing on Instagram, guys, at Jeff_Brantley. I hope you enjoyed the show. Hope you're enjoying your Friday. Enjoy your weekend. Enjoy all the fights we got coming up. And I'll certainly be tweeting along with them. So tweet along with me again at Jeff_Brantley. All right, everybody, take care. Have a good rest of your night. I'll talk to everybody later.